All right, welcome back to the second part of the Create Performance Task uh, Answers video. All right, so now we are on questions 10 and 11, and we are going to be looking at rows 4 and 5 of the rubric. So make sure you have your rubric open, and we're going to discuss rows 4 and 5. All right, so row 4. All right, the written response must include two program code segments, one showing a student developed procedure with at least one parameter that has an effect on the functionality of the procedure, one showing where the student developed procedure is being called, all right, and then describes what the identified procedure does and how it contributes to the overall functionality of the program. All right, so that's row 4. All right, so do we define a procedure? All right, so I have define on mouse press, mouse X, mouse Y. All right, so important to note that on mouse press is not considered a student developed procedure, right? This is part of the programming language, the development environment. So this is not a student developed procedure. However, it does take two parameters, right? So that would qualify, but it does not show student developed procedure, right? And so remember over here, the procedure must be student developed. Okay, it is not student developed, right? And so that would discount this student from getting row number 4, right? So the response earns point for row 4. That is false, right? So number 10 is false. All right, but what about 11? All right, so it is very important to note that if you go on to row 5, the written response includes a program code segment of a student developed algorithm. Now, it doesn't have to be a procedure here. It could just be any algorithm that includes sequencing, selection, and iteration. So now we are looking at what is inside of what the student highlighted, right? So it doesn't matter now if it's a procedure they wrote, just matters if this is an algorithm that includes sequencing, selection, and iteration. So sequencing, are there multiple steps that would be executed in order? Yes. Selection, is there an if and an else or elif or something like that? Yes, there's an if here and then an else, right? So it has selection and then iteration. There is a for loop here that would execute the number of scoops times. So there is iteration as well. All right, then explains in detailed steps how the identified algorithm works in enough detail that someone else could recreate it. All right, so okay, let's read what the student wrote. Okay, so the procedure I wrote is called on mouse press and takes parameters mouse X and mouse Y. When the procedure is called by the user clicking on the canvas, the coordinates of the click are passed into the procedure for values mouse X and mouse Y, which will determine whether the if or the else is executed in the algorithm. When the mouse X value is between 100 and 300, so this is explaining like the if, when the user will be prompted to enter a number of scoops, which will determine the number of scoops the ice cream cone will have that is drawn on the canvas. The first scoop drawn will be filled with the first color in the colors list. The second scoop will be filled with the second color, and so on. If the mouse X value is not between that, right, so now we're talking about the else, a label will appear on the canvas telling the user to click closer to the center. And so those details give the user or give the reader the ability to understand what the algorithm does. And so the answer for number 11, the response earns the point for row 5. That is a true statement. All right. So let's move along to problems 12 and 13. So now we're still looking at rows 4 and 5, right? So now let's go back to row 4 on our scoring criteria. All right. So we have a procedure being defined, draw cones, right? So yes, this is a student developed abstraction or a student developed procedure, all right? So that's first, two program code segments, one showing a student developed procedure with at least one parameter. Are there parameters? Yes, there are two parameters. Okay. Now it says with at least one parameter that has an effect on the functionality of the procedure. So, do you see mouse X and mouse Y in the procedure? Yes. If mouse X is this and mouse X is this, right, that is going to affect how the procedure works. All right. And so looks like that's good. And then another code segment, one showing where the student developed procedure is being called. So now you see the draw cones function is called in the on mouse press. And so that is how we are calling it with a mouse click. And so that is showing that. Now, did the student describe what the identified procedure does and how it contributes to the overall function of the program? All right, so let's read. All right, the procedure I wrote is called draw cones and takes parameters mouse X and mouse Y, which uses the user click to prompt the user to click again or prompt the user to enter the number of scoops that they would like to draw, right? So this is getting at the overall functionality of the program, right? And what it does, all right? And so that would mean that the student would earn the point for row 4. So 12 is true. All right, let's take a look at 13, okay? All right, 13. The written response includes a program code segment of a student developed algorithm. Yes, okay. We established that this would count as a student developed algorithm, but does it have sequencing, selection, and iteration? All right, so this is a slightly different code segment than the last one. Does it have sequencing? Yes. Does it have a number of steps that would be executed in order? Yes. Does it have selection? Yes. We have the if mouse x greater than 100 and mouse x less than 300, and then the else. Yes. But you'll notice there is no loop here. You don't see a for loop anywhere in here. And so the fact is that this thing does not have iteration. And so the student would not earn row 5. So the answer to row 5 is false. The response does not earn the point for row 5. All right. Now we do want to make sure, we look at the requirements for code segments and the requirements, the do not award a point, right? So the algorithm being described can utilize existing language functionality or library calls, right? An algorithm that contains selection and iteration also contains sequencing, right? So remember, if it has multiple steps, all right, that is sequencing. An algorithm containing sequencing, selection, and iteration that is not contained in a procedure can earn this point, right? So that is important, right? That was, a few questions ago, right? It wasn't a student developed procedure, but it still had sequencing, selection, and iteration. Use the first code segment as well as other code segments within the first code segment to determine whether the point is earned. If the code segment calls other student developed procedures, the procedures called from within the main procedure can be considered when evaluating the elements of sequencing, selection, and iteration. All right. Do not award a point if the response only describes what the selected algorithm does without explaining how it does it. The description of the algorithm does not match the included program code. The code segment consisting of the selected algorithm is not written in the written response. The algorithm is not explicitly identified. For example, the entire program is selected as an algorithm without explicitly identifying the code segment containing the algorithm. And then the use of either the selection or iteration is trivial and does not affect the outcome of the program. All right, so that's a little bit more about row 5. All right, but now let's move on to questions 14 and 15. Now we're getting at, once again, still rows 4 and 5. Okay, so row 4, once again, 2 code segments, 1 student developed procedure, 1 where the procedure is being called. So student developed procedure, yes, draw cones, right? That takes a parameter and the parameter has an effect on the function of the procedure. Okay. All right. And then do they show where they're calling the procedure? Yes. Once again. All right. So it sounds like that's going to be qualified, but does the student describe what the identified procedure does and how it does it? And how it contributes to the overall functionality of the program. All right, so let's read. The procedure I wrote is called draw cones and takes parameters mouse X and mouse Y, which uses the user click to prompt the user to click again or prompt the user to enter the number of scoops they would like to draw. All right. The procedure is called by the user clicking on the canvas, and the coordinates of the click are passed into the procedure for the values mouse X and mouse Y, which will determine whether the if or the else is executed in the algorithm. When the mouse X value is between 100 and 300, the user will be prompted to enter a number of scoops. The number the user enters will determine the number of scoops drawn, and the first scoop drawn will be filled with the first color in the colors list. Second scoop will be filled with the second color, and so on. If the mouse X value is not between 100 and 300, a label will appear on the canvas telling the user to click closer to the center of the canvas. All right, so Has the user describe what the identified procedure does and how it contributes to the overall functionality of the program? The answer is yes. So the response earns the point for row 4. That is a true statement. All right, what about row 5? Okay. Does the program code segment have a student developed algorithm that includes sequencing, selection, and iteration? So, sequencing, yes, a number of steps in order. Selection, yes, I've got an if and an else. And iteration, yes, the for loop exists in this code segment. All right, so now have they explained in enough detailed steps how the identified algorithm works in enough detail that someone else could recreate it? And the answer is yes. And so the answer to number 15 is true as well. All right. All right. 16, 17, and 18 are all getting at row 6. So we want to look at row 6 on the scoring guidelines. All right. So the written response describes 2 calls to the selected procedure, all right, that they identified in response 3C. Each call must pass different arguments, but that causes a different segment of code in the algorithm to execute. Describes the conditions being tested by each call to the procedure, and identifies the result of each call. All right, now, do not award a point if any one of the following is true. A procedure is not identified in written responses 3C, or the procedure does not have a parameter. The written response for 3D does not apply to the procedure in 3C. The 2 calls cause the same segment of code in the algorithm to execute. So this is important. All right. The response describes conditions being tested that are implausible, inaccurate, or inconsistent with the program, and the identified calls are either implausible, inaccurate, or inconsistent. So what they're saying has to actually be true. All right, so now we are looking at problem number 16. All right, so here is the identified algorithm. So this is a student developed procedure, right? And now 2 calls to the draw cones procedure could be draw cones 5200 and draw cones 22300. All right, the first call would pass the value 50 for mouse X into the procedure, which would cause the if statement to be false. Is that true? Well, yes, because 50 is not greater than 100, right? Thus, the else would execute. The second call would pass 220 for mouse X into the procedure, which would cause the if statement to be true and execute, which is true because 220 would be greater than 100 and less than 300. Okay. The output for the first call would be a label appearing on the canvas telling the user to click closer to the center, and the second call would prompt the user to enter a number, which would then determine how many scoops are drawn on the ice cream cone and produce the drawing to the canvas. So, did this response earn the point for row 6? Yes, that is true. Remember, because 2 calls were described within the written response, right? They passed different arguments that caused different segments of code to execute. They described what is being tested by each call, and it identified the result, the output of each of those calls. All right. So let's move on to 17. All right, so 17, now I have this code segment. 2 calls to the draw cone procedure could be draw cones 100, 200, and 100, 350. The first call would pass 100 for mouse X and 200 for mouse Y into the procedure, which would cause the if statement to execute and the user to be prompted to enter a number. Is that true? 100 for mouse X. So now, if mouse X is greater than 100, right? 100 is not greater than 100, so the if statement would not execute. So what this person has suggested is not true, right? The second call would pass 100 for mouse X and 350 for mouse Y into the procedure, and the else statement would execute. Well, yes, this is true, right? The else would execute. They've already stated something that is incorrect, and the 100 being passed in for mouse X in both calls would not constitute different arguments. Yes, the 350 and the 200 are different, but remember, mouse Y is an irrelevant parameter, so that would not play a role in this function. All right, so the user would not get it because each call did not pass different arguments that caused different segments of code to execute, right? But also, what they have stated was inaccurate, right? And so they would not earn the point for row 6 on problem 17. Okay. Now, if you also read, the output for the first call would be an ice cream cone drawn with the number of scoops the user specified. The output for the second call would be a label appearing on the canvas telling the user, right? So, yes, this statement is false because of what they described up here that was incorrect, right? So, once again, another reason that this answer would be false. All right, let's look at problem number 18. Okay. So now, same code segment as the previous two problems. Okay. Two calls to the draw cones procedure could be draw cones 120, 100, and 190, 300. All right. So now different arguments, right? So 120, 100, 190, 300. Okay. The first call would pass 120 for mouse X and 100 for mouse Y into the procedure, which would cause the if statement to execute. The second call would pass 190 for mouse X and 300 for mouse Y into the procedure, and the if statement would also execute, right? So now go back over here. Do not award a point if any of the following is true. The two calls cause the same code segment of code in the algorithm to execute, even if the result is different. Both of those calls are going to cause the if to execute, right? And so therefore, you are not going to earn the point for row 6 here. All right. And it says both calls would result in the user being prompted to enter a number, but the user could enter different numbers and a different amount of scoops would appear. So here's like the ultimate result could end up being different, but the same segment of code would be executed with those two calls, right? And so that would be the user not earning row 6. All right. So that is problems 10 through 18. All right. So I hope you enjoyed this video and you developed a better understanding of the Create Performance Task rubric.